we are going to quickly expose the rules and principles of comparative or historical or even evolutionary linguistics, as well as the goal targeted by this linguistics. Then, we will bring out the criteria which authorize and validate the comparison between the Metremenkhemi, the Coptic, and the modern Black African languages. French and Provençal, for example, are joined by a form of language that predates the two, the Vulgar Latin of Gaul. The Latin language was widespread in the 1st century BC throughout Gaul until the Rhine River. In other words, the current states of French and Provençal, now different, are states of a single prior linguistic form. Now, what is called for convenience the specific Vulgar Latin of Gaul is only a particular form that is only slightly differentiated from Vulgar Latin in general. From then on, the kinship of French and Provençal widens in space and time, since the Romance languages represent the linguistic diversification of spoken Latin during the High Middle Ages, 5th, 8th century. The Romance languages include Gallo-Romance, Doil language dialects, including French and Franco-Provençal, Cisalpine, Rhaeto-Friulian, Gallo-Italian dialects, the Doc language Occitan and Gascon dialects, and Catalan, which occupies an intermediate linguistic position between Gallo-Romance and Ibero-Romance, Ibero-Romance, Portuguese, Spanish, and dialects. The glosses of San Millán de la Cogolla at the end of the 10th century constitute the first written mentions in a Spanish dialect. Italo-Romance, Tuscan, Central and Southern dialects, dialects of Sardinia. The first document written in a Vulgar Italian dialect dates from the end of the 10th century. It is the Charter of Monte Cassino, 960-963, Balkano-Romance, Romanian, Dalmatian. All these modern Romance languages are therefore historical continuities of Latin. Each of them includes dialects, local dialects, patois, professional slangs. Thus, for example, Picard and Norman, Poitevin and Berrichon are related to each other and are also related to French and Franco-Provençal, and consequently to Latin. If a given Spanish patois no longer has much in common today with another Romanian patois, for example, this difference is simply explained by the fact that the two linguistic forms have been separated for a very long time. However, Latin forms with certain Indo-European languages. The group of Italic languages, the Italic languages are divided as follows. Latin Faliscan spoken in Faleri on the middle course of the Tiber. Veneto spoken in Veneto. Umbrian spoken in the Apennines. Oscan is the language of the Samnites of Samnium extended to Campania, Lucania, and Bruttium, the Sabellian dialects, Volscian and Marsan. The Celtic languages, Gaelic which died out almost without a trace, Brittonic which survives in modern Welsh and Breton, Gaelic attested since the 8th century and whose main representative is Irish, are very close to the Italic languages in the Indo-European whole. Other Indo-European languages, also closely related, form other groups. Germanic languages, German, English, Dutch or Flemish, Scandinavian languages, Slavic languages, Russian, Polish, Czech, Bulgarian, Serbo-Croatian. The Baltic group, Lithuanian. The Indo-Aryan languages, Vedic Sanskrit, modern languages of India, and the Iranian languages, Avestic, Old Persian, modern Iranian languages including Persian, Kurdish, Afghan. Greek, Armenian, and Albanian Tocharian, attested in the 7th century AD and now extinct, are isolated Indo-European languages, like Hittite. All these languages, divided into groups, families, branches, come from a single language, precisely Indo-European, so-called conventionally. Indo-European has never been written. Numerous scholars connect Indo-European speakers with the Yamnaya culture. The attested Indo-European languages appear in history at very different dates. From the 2nd millennium BC, we have Hittite in Asia Minor, east of Ankara. To the 2nd millennium AD, we have Albanian and the Baltic languages. Albanian has only been attested since the 15th century, and Baltic from the 16th century only in the form of Old Prussian, which is now dead. On the other hand, Lithuanian and Lette have been preserved until modern times. One can follow the development of certain Indo-European languages over a long period, such as Greek, from Mycenaean Greek of the 20th millennium BC to modern Greek today. From Central Asia, Tocharian of Chinese Turkestan and the Indo-Aryan languages of India, to the western extremity of Europe, Celtic languages. Indo-European thus covers an immense space. These are migrations, pre- or proto-historic movements that disperse the population speaking Indo-European languages on this space. From all the above, we can validly draw the following conclusions. Languages evolve and change. Diachronic linguistics precisely studies the successive modifications of languages, their evolution. The evolutionary rate of languages is quite slow, and a language evolves even if it is not written. A language has an oral tradition independent of writing. The object of synchronic linguistics is to study the system of a language as it functions at a given moment. In reality, diachronic and synchronic linguistics fit together. It is the comparative method which restores the broad lines of the pre-dialectal mother tongue. By comparing the sounds, phonetics, the forms of words and grammar, morphology, the lexicological facts, vocabulary, common to the different languages, which are various forms taken over time by a single language. The comparative method shows that a language is rarely isolated in time and space. That is to say that it is rare, in the world, to encounter a language that does not belong to a community or family, or linguistic group, more or less extensive, more or less ancient. This belonging is reflected in deep resemblances, which are not fortuitous, or acquired resemblances, through the phenomenon of linguistic borrowing. They are therefore inherited correspondences, or resemblances. Ferdinand de Saussure himself found it just that the comparative method could succeed in fixing the prehistory of compared languages. The retrospective method therefore makes us penetrate into the past of a language beyond the oldest documents. Ferdinand de Saussure, Course in General Linguistics, critical edition by Tullio de Mauro, Paris, Payot, 1978, pi de 293. This is the goal. The genetic classification of languages compared and studied beyond the oldest written documents. A genetic and historical linguistics exists. It is within it that a general linguistics developed, as we have just seen with Indo-European. To achieve this goal, the method is de rigueur. Genetic kinship is a function linking languages. It consists in the fact that each element of expression of a language is linked by a function to an element of expression of another. The function of each element is conditioned by its surroundings and by the position it occupies in the word. Louis Hjelmslev, Le Langage. An introduction, Paris, Les Éditions de Minuit, 1966, par 5-2. The method is comparative and inductive. One starts from the instruction of the similarities and also of the differences between the languages compared to demonstrate the common origin of these languages. Distinct languages today derive from a single language if a continuity is more or less established between the compared languages genetically. Regarding this genetic relationship of languages, Émile Benveniste further clarifies the methodology, specifying, the proofs of this relationship consist of regular similarities, defined by correspondences between complete forms, morphemes, phonemes. It is obvious that the series impose themselves and that the coincidences of chance must be eliminated, as well as the borrowings, the effects of convergence. The presumption of kinship is acquired if the proofs are conclusive. Thus, the correspondence between lat est, sunt, all, jest, sind, phrases, ye, so, etc., supposes both phonetic equations, the same morphological structure, the same alternation, the same classes of verb forms, and the same meaning. The method is known. It made it possible to establish the large linguistic family conventionally called Indo-European. Can we apply this method to the languages of the African continent known to be without writing? Emile Benveniste replies, "This method is well known, and it has been tested in the establishment of more than one family. The proof is made that it can also be applied to languages without history whose kinship is observed today. Today, whatever structure they belong to, the regularity of phonetic correspondences and the possibility of foreseeing certain evolutions are not limited to any type of language or to any region. There is therefore no reason to imagine that exotic or primitive languages require other criteria of comparison than Indo-European or Semitic languages. Linguistic science is no less universal than the other sciences. There is no scientific prejudice against applying the comparative and inductive method of genetic and historical linguistics to Black African languages, to all the languages of the world. Moreover, the ultimate goal of this linguistics is to be able to operate a general classification of all known human languages. It is enough to lay down our criteria and thus to legitimize the genetic comparison between the Metremenkhemi, the Coptic, and the modern Black African languages. These criteria are essential and operational. The language has an oral tradition independent of writing. The Latin of the 3rd century BC and the Lithuanian of the 16th century both offer, however distant they may be in space and time, the same faithful image of Indo-European. We can therefore compare the Metremenkhemi forms with the corresponding Black African forms, even if we do not have before our eyes all the successive states of the Black African languages. Bloomfield has historically compared 4 major languages of the Central Algonquin group: Fox, Ojibwe, Created, and Menominee. He was thus able to symbolize by forms reconstructed from the languages attested, which are the primitive Central Algonquian or the Proto-Algonquin, but the American linguist did not have, for the 4 languages compared, recordings or from earlier documents, for which we have no older records. The criteria of the comparison are guaranteed by the Metremenkhemi, who is the oldest witness of the languages compared. The classification is only sure of its criteria if it has, for some at least of these languages, more elders. However, the most archaic Kemetic hieroglyphic texts date back to about 3,000 years before our era, and the first written manifestations of Coptic from the 3rd century before our era. Consequently, the enormous geographical discontinuity militates in favor of the exclusion of the loan in these old times on the whole of the established concordances. Morphological, phonetic, and lexicological. That is to say that the very old separation of the pre-dialectal common stock eliminates the effects of convergence, chance, and borrowing. In other words, if connections of a serial nature are established between Metremenkhemi, Coptic, and the modern Black African languages, one is authorized to recognize a family resemblance, a kinship by sequence, according to the expression of the systematics of plants, even if we deviate a great deal from the initial type, from the reconstructed prototypes. So, one should therefore not exaggerate the difficulties, not doubtless at the level of real, empirical, comparative work, but at the level of theory, of the legitimacy of the comparison. The linguistic history of mankind even demands that such work be vigorously undertaken. For strict linguistics, things seem clear, theoretically. The method is known with all its requirements, its purpose as well, and it is legitimate, linguistically, to compare the Metremenkhemi, the Coptic, with the current African languages. But what about Egyptology? The author of the first Metremenkhemi grammar, Champollion, was fully convinced that the ancient Metremenkhemi language differed in no essential respect from the language vulgarly called Coptic, and that the Metremenkhemi words, written in hieroglyphic characters on the most ancient monuments of Thebes, and in Greek characters in the Coptic books, have an identical value and differ in general only by the absence of certain medial vowels, omitted in the primitive spelling. Champollion means that Metremenkhemi and Coptic constitute one and the same language. That Coptic, written with the Greek alphabet, is vocalized Metremenkhemi, that it is therefore possible to vocalize ancient Metremenkhemi from Coptic, and that it is eminently arbitrary to neglect Coptic in studies of pharaonic grammar. But Egyptology did not work in the direction initially indicated by Champollion himself. Ancient Metremenkhemi has been authoritatively made a Semitic language. Coptic was silently evacuated from Metremenkhemi linguistic studies. Here, Egyptology sinned by presumption and racist pride. The civilizations of the Hamito-Nubian Nile Valley altogether could be neither African, geographically speaking, nor from the Black world, culturally speaking. It is therefore appropriate to pay a vibrant tribute to the memory of Serge Sauneron. His intellectual honesty is equal to that of Champollion. For Sauneron, in fact, the Metremenkhemi language is not a Semitic language, and the Metremenkhemi grammars, written until now according to the model of Semitic grammars, do not really reflect the genius proper to the pharaonic language. Metremenkhemi could not be isolated from its African context, and Semitic did not account for its birth. It was therefore legitimate to find relatives or cousins in Africa. The Cairo conference included the following Egyptologists: Abdelgadir M. Abdallah, Sudan; A. Abu Bakr, Egypt; Ms. N. Blanc, France; F. de Bono, Malta; Sheikh Anta Diop, Senegal; G. Galad, Egypt; L. Habachi, Egypt; R. Holter, Finland; S. Hussein, Egypt; Ms. J. Gordon-Jacquet, USA; W. Kaiser, FRG; J. Leclan, France; G. Mokhtar, Egypt; R. El Nadouri, Egypt; Thuzo Benga, Congo; S. Sauneron, France; T. Soderberg, Sweden; P. L. Shini, Canada; Vercuda, France. Observers included Professors V. L. Grottinelli, Italy; S. Haile Selassie, Ethiopia; Fawzia Helmi Hussein, Egypt; El Kakosi, Hungary; and Senegalese journalist Papa Amit Diop. UNESCO itself was represented by Mr. Glele and Mrs. Melcher. The conference rapporteur was Professor Jean Devis, France. Rarely has Egyptology brought together such a scientific assembly in Egypt itself. The debates were obviously free, involving only the competence and information of each participant. Here are two more significant statements. Professor Vercuta said that, for him, Egypt was African in its writing, in its culture, and in its way of thinking. Professor Leclan recognized this same African character in the temperament and the way of thinking of the Metrremenkhemi. Here, African means black. Thus, the pharaonic civilization belongs entirely to the black African cultural world. Pharaonic Kemet was not Semitic, even less Indo-European in its writing, in its culture, and in its way of thinking. It was African, like Nubia, Abyssinia, Zimbabwe, Ghana, Benin, Yoruba. In short, like all other civilizations once built on the African continent by black Africans. A new page in African historiography was therefore written in Cairo in 1974. Egyptology and other African or Africanist studies should know this clearly. Among the many recommendations made by the International Colloquium in Cairo, and therefore by all the participants, we note this one. The cooperation of specialists in comparative linguistics should be called upon at the international level to establish all the possible correlations between the languages, African cultures, and ancient Metremenkhemi. Isn't this recommendation new, important, fundamental? It was made by the best Egyptologists of our day, then meeting in Cairo, to debate the problems of specialists in Egyptology In the relations of this historical science with Black Africa, there would be only the excuse of incompetence to keep away from such an urgent request. Possible technical obstacles are not insurmountable. Ultimately, linguistics, F. de Saussure, Bloomfield, Yamslev, Benveniste, and Egyptology, Champollion, Sauneron, Egyptological Symposium in Cairo, are in favor of a systematic, well-educated comparison between the Metremenkhemi, the Coptic, and the modern Black African languages, in order to find, between the languages thus compared, a unity of origin. Conclusion. The African linguistic fact is varied and diverse, but from the point of view of historical linguistics, three large families emerge clearly, distinctly. A. Paleo African or Niger Egyptian, B. Berber, and C. Khoisan. There are no Hamitic or Hamitic languages on the African continent. Therefore, Hamito-Semitic or Afro-Asian remains a pure linguistic illusion. Metremenkhemi and Coptic cannot be included in Semitic as a class, group, or branch, as is the case with Ugaritic, Akkadian, Babylonian, Phoenician, Hebrew, Arabic, South Arabic, etc. No competent Semitizer considers Metremenkhemi and Coptic as a Semitic language, from far or near. Berber, on the other hand, is not genetically linked to the pharaonic Metremenkhemi and Coptic languages either. It's an abuse, rather a mistake, to make Semitic, Metremenkhemi, and Berber linguistic groups of the same family. In reality, no scholar has done so according to the only method in force in such studies, that is to say, the method of comparative and historical linguistics, or even evolutionary, diachronic. The Cairo Symposium, 1974, settled this false debate, recommending establishing all possible correlations between African languages and ancient Metremenkhemi. Since the Metremenkhemi language, Pharaonic and Coptic, came out of itself from the framework of the Semitic and Berber languages. In the course of this work, we have precisely demonstrated the non-reality of the Afro-Asian family by situating ourselves on the strict level of historical linguistics. On the other hand, we were able to reconstruct Paleo African, i.e., the primitive language common to the historically attested languages that are the Metremenkhemi, Cushitic, Chadic, Nilo-Saharan, Niger-Kordofanian languages, all ancient and modern languages spoken by Black peoples from Africa since the old Pharaonic Kemet. They are all genetically related when they are compared in a tight and adequate way. From all angles, phonetic, phonological, morphological, grammatical, lexicological, without the enlightening contribution of the Pharaonic Metremenkhemi and Coptic language, which remains the Sanskrit of general African linguistics, it is radically impossible to glimpse the profound genetic unity of the Black African languages, their historical and temporal dimension. To get general African linguistics out of the current repetitions and impasses as well as from its secular minor status, that of endless standard descriptions and without a precise linguistic project, since comparison is constantly avoided, set aside or ignored, it is necessary to take into account the Pharaonic Metremenkhemi and Coptic language, which must henceforth have its place in the African university, alongside Greek and Latin, Arabic, Dravidian, etc. It is in the order of things possible for the African intelligentsia to build rapidly, in Africa itself, a general and historical linguistics from the languages of the various African peoples. This would be an immense contribution to global general linguistics, whose scientific and cultural ambition, since Ferdinand de Saussure, remains the exploration and constitution of the linguistic families of the world within the framework of a total semiology. It was also the ardent desire of Humboldt, of Benveniste in Europe, of Peirce in the United States. Our work, modest, nevertheless presents itself as the very unveiling of the African linguistic universe, henceforth united under the panoramic gaze of the historical and cultural time of African societies since Ancient Kemet. By reconnecting in this way with the thread of history, their own, the African languages, united in a family taken up, however, by each of them over time, then draw a global structure which projects them together towards world linguistics, as groups and branches of a single linguistic family. African linguistics would make a huge blunder by suspending reflection on its own status in the speaking production of humanity. But what is the linguistic future of Africa? This future is at the very heart of the destiny of the peoples of Africa in the contemporary world. Multiple battles that are those of our lives. Saving oral traditions, schooling in African languages, need for the unity of the African continent to better address together the economic, monetary, industrial, technological, military, information and communication problems, of control of raw materials, of cooperation with other countries and peoples of the world, without unnecessarily perpetuating the old and alienating psychology. The African linguistic file, intimately linked to the Pan-African cultural file, has always preoccupied Africans aware of their collective future. Wole Soyinka, at Festac 77 in Lagos, strongly emphasized the need for linguistic unity on a continental scale. He proposed Swahili as the language of inter-African communication. Such a position on the part of a man of Soyinka's caliber had strongly marked the minds of the participants at the Festac in Lagos. We also remember that the problem of African languages had been the subject of numerous and fruitful debates during the colloquium organized by this same Festac 77. Important recommendations were made in plenary session. Teach African languages from kindergarten to university. Systematically literate the popular masses in African languages, their own, in order to integrate them into the social, cultural, and economic development of African states. Undertake the professional, scientific, technical, and technological training of the African in the African languages of culture and great communication. Create in each African state research centers on languages, oral and written literature, the arts, etc. Everywhere the need is keenly felt, that of considering African languages as development tools. African specialists, Pate Diagne, Abdoulaye Balde of the University of Dakar, Non Samia Konde, Director of the Department of Continuing Education, Action and Educational Research of Togo, and many others, have regularly granted far-reaching interviews on the revalorization of African national languages. In Douala, from July 2 to 14, 1973, a decisive seminar was organized on African languages, a factor of development, Actes du Séminaire, published by the Liberman College of Douala, 1974. Cameroonian intellectuals, under the direction of Professor Henri Marcel Bodbanyok, then effectively tackled all aspects of the problem submitted to their reflection. African languages, vehicles of civilization, modern transcription of African languages, local languages, and development of the nation. African languages and scientific thought, African languages and philosophical reflection, textbooks for teaching, African languages, development of linguistic atlases, etc. The Intergovernmental Conference on Cultural Policies in Africa, organized by UNESCO with the cooperation of the OAU in Accra from October 27th to November 6th, 1975. Final report, Paris, UNESCO, considered that the African languages and traditions were essential supports for any educational and cultural promotion in Africa. Concretely, many African countries have already paved the way in Black Africa by upgrading and developing local languages, teaching official speeches, literacy. In concrete terms too, Professor Cheikh Anta Diop has translated into his mother tongue, Wolof, long texts covering the fields of set theory, mathematical, and theoretical physics, the organization of matter at the subquantum and quantum level, special and general relativity, as well as relativistic cosmology, tensor algebra, quantum chemistry. Considerable progress is still being made thanks to the many research centers that now exist in Africa. The future can thus be viewed with some optimism. This contemporary seizure of Africans on their own social and cultural being, on their history and their native languages, which all hold from a pre-dialectal common ancestor. It is still and always the work of all the African people on the move.